Today we're going to be talking about, we feel like we need to affirm some things. Today we're going to be talking about what are we for and what are we not for. So we're going to affirm some things that we're for and then affirm some things that we're not for. We're going to try to do it seasoned with salt because here's two white guys on a podcast talking about black issues. And, that's kind of a little bit of a pushback in today's time. Not that it should be, but it is. So let's start off with some things that we are for, so people can kind of see our heart in what we're doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're certainly for conversation, for trying to understand one another, because we're for all people, and all people afforded the same basic human rights to survival and safety, security, and just opportunity in life overall, whether that's economic opportunity, just the opportunity, again, to be safe and secure in your community, opportunity to raise your family and protect and keep them and have enable them to have the best opportunity. And maybe those kind of things ought to seem evident and obvious, but maybe there are people in the world who don't care about those things, don't consider it a priority, or don't actively prioritize them. But from our worldview, they demand the utmost respect, for sure.
I think that's important. What you said, from our worldview, your foundation matters in terms of what you just said, right? I mean, you just said some things that have to be grounded in the Judeo-Christian system. I mean, they have to be. There's no other way to present those things as these are rights, these are commanded, these are decreed from the beginning that all man should be provided these rights.
Created equal by the Creator doesn't mean that we treat each other equal or have had equal opportunity in this world, but we are created equal and then given rights to us as humans that can't be taken away from another human. By another human.
Yeah, and I don't want to get off topic today, but a guy asked me this on my Facebook comment post. He was talking about, well, doesn't your God, doesn't he decree slavery in the Old Testament? And just very quickly, because this is not this conversation, but I think where people really misunderstand that is they don't take the high view of the story of God and understand that God created all men equal, and then he said, take dominion over the earth, subdue it, keep it, take care of it. So God gave us that responsibility to do these things. And so God's not going to step in every time and mash out what we are supposed to be doing, right? Now, he obviously restrains evil in so many ways, and not to go into those ways, but at the same time, he's also allowing us to do life the way that we decided to do it when we rebelled against him, right? I mean, he said, this is the way to do life. Follow me, walk with me. I want to lead you into the fullness of joy. We rebelled, we sinned, we walked out of that. And he said, okay, I'm going to let y'all try this little experiment out. And he's been allowing us while also guiding it in ways because he was going to redeem it from the beginning, right? And so I think people need to understand that God is still allowing us for purposes to go through what we have caused, not what God has caused, what we have caused, to go through these things as dominion takers, as royal representatives, so that one day in eternity, he's able to show us it's not good when you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's not good when you play God. Only I am worthy to play God. You are not God, right? And so just throw that out there because people are kind of confused over the biblical understanding of these things, that we are called to do these things because we are God's royal representatives. We are the dominion takers, right? We are to subdue and keep the earth, which means fighting for humanity, fighting for rights, fighting for these things and making sure our brother is being treated fairly and justly.
Well, and that's only necessary in a fallen world where humans do sin
Yes.
and cause all kinds of problems for ourselves and one another. And, probably highest on that list certainly would be to kill or harm another human being in any way, because we are our brother's keeper. But then a close second would probably be to enslave another human being, which is basically the same thing as harming them and ultimately killing them, because you're taking their life away from them, their freedom away from them. So it's abhorrent. It's abhorrent to God. It's abhorrent to us. And rightly should be, because of the image of God in all of us, abhorrent to every human being. And so we stand on that. We affirm that. Absolutely. For sure.
We're also for the fact that bad cops ought to be disciplined. Bad cops ought to be charged. And I don't think there's anybody out there that's not for that, except the very, 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 very small percentage of bad cops, right? I mean, sometimes even in our affirmation of these things, I'm like, it's weird we have to affirm these things. I hadn't seen anybody get online yet. I mean, I've been on social media and on the web trying to study these things and seek them out and make sure that what we're saying is right. But I have not found one video that's been these things are good. It is good that we stomp out black people. It is good that cops deal with them this way. It is good that George Floyd was suffocated. It is good that, you know what I'm saying? I can't find those videos, but you would think they were everywhere with the emotion that's rising up right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I don't think that people, true. I mean, and if those things were out there, then people would perhaps be more rightly incensed. But I don't know if it's because of that so much that people suggest that it's just simply that perhaps along the way, either sometimes the cops who might be guilty of these things don't go, they don't get punished. Then in other ways, the perceived racism and things in the system, in the justice system, the criminal justice system overall, and the lack of change over time, or not change not fast enough, and that these things continue to happen, is probably then drawn from that is perhaps the fact that, or where people arrive at the conclusion that, the establishment powers don't want to see these things change. They must agree with it in some sort of way. Or when it is so seems to be so consistently carried out, maybe not to the extreme of someone dying, but the harassment and the things that are more daily, the perceived harassment, again, whether there's always different sides to a story and everything, but just the ongoing tension that exists between law enforcement and people and black community, and how the perception of that being unfair. And so I mean, I think we would affirm that and agree that those things exist.
Sure.
Right? There's this grave injustice in American history with the slave trade and, Americans owning African slaves. But yet that history is probably more complex and, nuanced than we typically want to look back on it and recognize. But still, the fact that it happened and that's where we're coming from creates a lot of baggage for us as a society, and a lot of deep, deep, deep wounds, particularly among Black Americans, but really all Americans. And so after several generations of coming out of that, and under Jim Crow and in the civil rights era and all these various things, I mean, we're still not all the way up out of it yet. And so lots and lots and lots of injustices are happening all along the way. Even if we're making progress, if you're thrown in the mud puddle and you're covered in mud and you wash a little bit of it off, you're still super dirty, you know?
Yeah.
Like you're not all the way clean yet. So though we're making progress out of that, it's not fast enough because it should have never happened to start with. And anyway, there's just, again, all this history is full of details that we don't mean to gloss over in any way. We're just simply trying to acknowledge that there's real pain, there's real hurt, there's real injustice all along the way up into the present day.
Yeah.
And not trying to minimize. Actually, I mean, I think we could acknowledge, because of our biblical worldview and appreciating the weightiness of this sin, man, these things have probably hurt us and scarred us and wounded us in deeper ways than any of us sort of recognize, even the Black American who knows how awful it is, but yet the deep wounds of it and the way that it affects you emotionally and psychologically, it impacts your relationships and your relationship with all of society. Yeah. I mean, there's ways that we don't even understand
what could have life been like.
Yeah.
Right? There's that. What could have, if we would have honored God and then honored the Imago Dei. Love the Lord thy God with all their heart, mind, and soul, and love thy neighbor as thyself. Love God and love the Imago Dei in others, the image of God in others. If we would have done that from the beginning, what would have life been like? And that's what a redeemed heaven is going to be like, right? Where all these things that you're talking about, all these scars, all these wounds, all this past, all this present, like we see through. Like I said something in a video and people went nuts that I said I don't see color, right? And obviously Dustin has a black tattoo right here. I see color in that sense. That's not what I was trying to say, but people tried to drive that on top of me, right? He's saying he don't even see color. How could he say that? Everybody sees color. But the point was, I don't see color the way that they want me to see color, the way that they want me to divide people out into separate races and then treat everybody differently. I don't see color that way because that's not our worldview. That's not our narrative. And although even the world that we're living in is wounded, it's broken, it's sinful, we're still called to thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So although we are dealing with all these things inside of us, we have to move past those. We have to humble ourselves. We have to renew our minds daily in the narrative of God, and we have to push it into the world so that the world can see what the kingdom is like, so that the world can see who God is instead of buying into the narrative. And that's what we refuse to do. We refuse to step inside the narrative and operate the way that they tell us we have to operate, because that doesn't help the world. And I think even in revisionist history, I mean, we're going to talk about this in the next podcast, but even in the idea that slavery started back here and then we've been progressing along the way, there's this idea that all of America was racist. And therefore, since we've been progressing, we only got to where half of us aren't now, right? But the reality is half of us had to not be racist to even start the movement with the people in the war. Like, we fought for the freedom of slaves. And then we fought in the civil rights alongside our black brother. Like, there was a whole bunch of white people that were not for this. I'm like, and to kind of act like the black people just rose up on their own, the 12% of them, whatever the percent they are back then, that's what they are today, and just defied the other 80% of white people. I'm like, that's absurd. Like, there has always been a large group of people with a biblical foundation that's been like, this is wrong, and it's worth bleeding for. It's worth bleeding for, because there was a whole group of white people that died so that slaves could be set free. And there was a whole group of people that died in the civil rights movement that were white, walking along MLK, and were hated more so than MLK because they're white. They're not supposed to be there. Like, what did they do? They're white. They're supposed to be on our side. And that's the narrative we won't affirm, right? And so there was a whole group of people that hated them as much as, or more so than they hated MLK, because they're not supposed to be there. So I think that should be affirmed as well. Like, there's always been a large group of white people that have despised this as much as the black community has despised this.
Yeah, and just because it goes back to not being I mean, of course, we're dealing with this racial issue, but the principal way of combating it is not really to affirm the division between us, but to recognize the commonality between us.
Yeah.
And again, you could do that in a general humanistic sense, and certainly non-Christians believe in this same value and principle of people being equal. But the place where that originates, where we can stand on it again, is the Christian worldview and the Bible and God creating us all that way.
Yeah.
And so people, as they've recognized that throughout history, have sided with God. It's not about so much siding with any other group other than siding for the whole, siding with the whole, and for perhaps those who are being oppressed. So you look on those in an unfortunate position, again, which is a biblical concept.
Yes,
Look to those who are in need, who are hurting, who are being oppressed, who are suffering injustice at the hands of those in power. And so
we pass over those Levitical laws, though, right? We don't want to talk about those.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But it's challenging, and it goes back to just the need to want to hear each other and understand, and for everybody to want to do that for one another, because so much of what is offered to us or presented as a result or consequence, or offered as a solution to deal with these things, isn't necessarily like the best solution, the right way to go with it, or much of it seems to just fuel the divide and cause people to get defensive and feel the need to defend their identity group in some way.
But Dustin, and this is what somebody's saying on the other end of this camera, right? But Dustin, look, we protested peacefully. Look at what Colin Kaepernick, he was peacefully protesting, and y'all didn't hear us, but you hear us now, right? That's what somebody's saying.
Yeah.
I mean, I can hear it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I mean, and to a degree, there's some truth to that. I mean, because I think there is a lot of angst and frustration among people in general, but Black people especially, that these things perhaps are still ongoing, that there's still issues that they have to be concerned about. And so and when that happens over time, then maybe there's something more serious to be done, more consequential. But there's lots of other options than, and it's one thing to protest and demonstrate and be passionate and emotional, fired up, ready for change, and to be working toward that change, even sort of making your demands to the system, of course, and the system is considered corrupt and not willing or able to fix the problem. So I get where the frustration will come from, yet the pushback is what we've already said, though, is we've come from the worst possible place, and we've been improving over time. And it's been slow, and it's been too slow. And I'd say a big part of that is, and it's perhaps the biggest thing we can get out of all of this that would be actually constructive, is to acknowledge that we're not dealing with this actively the way we ought. And even if that's as simple as listening and hearing the grievances of our brothers and sisters in our community, in our society, a segment of our population that feels oppressed in some way. We should want to hear what they have to say, even if we don't always agree with one another. We should want to hear people's grievances. I don't always agree
with my wife, but I found it's best to listen.
Yeah. I mean, because you love people, and even if you know they're not entirely right or whatever, that doesn't mean that what they're feeling is wrong. It just We have to wrestle through it. It's complicated. It's difficult. And we as people, fallen people, not good at communicating, not good at expressing ourselves, we don't do that well. I don't do that well with my wife. I don't communicate well with my family and my coworkers and in all these spheres of life. I'm not a great communicator. So I'm going to like proactively engage in awkward conversation around race or some other issue. I mean, I actually kind of enjoy those conversations, but most people don't, and they're not equipped to handle them. They're not equipped with information. They inherently, it gets accusational, and then people get defensive. So the conversation that we need to have, the types of engagement that would more quickly move this process forward and allow for healing. I mean, you think even if somebody suffered child abuse or some sort of serious abuse in their past, what they desperately need is to talk about it, get it off their chest, be healed and relieved by getting it out. And but they don't, because it's hard, it's difficult, they suppress it.
Because of that abuse, she therefore trusts no men, and somebody has to tell her that's not how all men are. And if she doesn't talk about it, she'll always never trust all men, right? And so now she builds up this, I don't want to have anything to do with men. So she goes through her life missing out on the blessing of marriage that God wanted to give her because of a real damage that happened back there, and because no one was willing to sit down and talk to her.
Yeah, and on the other side of it, a husband or another person in their life who comes along and who doesn't take the time to recognize and understand and appreciate the pain that person is in, and just kind of dismisses it, or like, you'll get over it, or they just don't accept the fact that it was real. It really happened to them. And that it hurts and they still suffer from it. Then that person's never going to be able to connect with their spouse or whoever. They're never going to have the quality of relationship. And probably at some point when the pain of that comes to the surface, then the spouse is not going to be able to understand it and deal with it. They're going to conflict and blow up, and the relationship is going to be damaged and ruined. And they're not going to be able to move forward in a good way, but it's going to cause more problems and pain. And that's what we see in our society. We're not dealing with it well. We haven't. So we're suffering from the pain and consequences.
And I can speak into this a little bit, because in my first year of marriage with my wife, and I don't think she'll mind me saying this, in my first year of marriage with my wife came from a first marriage where she had a rough divorce and some other things that had happened that had really pained her and had really hurt her heart in some really, really terrible ways. And my pastor that married us told me, he said, you need to be prepared for this, because you're entering into something that God wants to use you to redeem it. Like, he wants to use you to redeem her vision of what that husband is supposed to be like, of what Christ is supposed to be to the bride. Like, he wants to use you in this, but you better be ready, because that's not an easy manner. That's going to be a difficult challenge, because it's going to raise its ugly head at times. It's going to cause things that you've been dealing with in your past to raise its ugly head at times. In my first year of marriage, I didn't do that well. I got bitter. I got bitter because in my head I wanted to go, man, that didn't have nothing to do with me. Like, this is my first time. Like, I want a fresh start. I want to start afresh. I want to start new. And I think in this conversation, in this struggle in society right now, that's the same thing going on from the white side of things. We're going, I didn't have nothing to do with that. I didn't do anything to her. Why am I having to deal with it? But what we ought to do is do what God tells us to do as a husband, and we ought to enter into it. And although I didn't do these things, God has commissioned me and called me to walk alongside my wife and help her raise up out of these things a bad perception of what men are like. And maybe, just maybe, God has called us as the godly. You can only say this to godly people, because ungodly people they're like, whatever, man, I'm doing me. But the church, white people in the church, maybe God has called us to rise up in such a way and to walk alongside of our black brothers and be the husband to them the way we are to our wives, right? That's all God's telling us to do. Be Christ in marriage and be Christ to your brother. Like, do that. You don't have to agree I don't have to agree with my wife's perception, but it's not always good for me to go in and go, listen, babe, that's them. This is what they did. I hadn't done, like, that ain't going to work well for me. Like in my marriage, it's just not.
Yeah, and oftentimes, I mean, we know what we've experienced and we know what we feel, and that's real. And nobody can take that from you or tell you how to process that or what it's been like for you. But, there perhaps a bigger picture or more to understand about life. So, if someone were to experience those things in their past and never know the hope of reconciliation and healing and those things, then they would continue to move through the rest of their life pained by that. But if they can find the source of hope and healing, then they can recover and perhaps then begin to view life and interact with life in a much more healthy and positive way. And so, that if some similar place is where we might be now in our society, then our hope is that we really can engage this moment constructively. And when I say we, all people, all of society, everybody from the individuals, the friends and the neighbors and coworkers in their little personal conversations in their communities to, these higher levels of leaders in societies, thinkers, those who are really driving the conversation forward and people, maybe in our case where, we're trying to have a little bit larger impact. But
yes. And so using the same analogy, because I think this is a good transition, using the same analogy, what I learned was in my first year of marriage, I should have just been loving my wife. I should have just been listening to her, allowing her to vent, allowing her to respond maybe in an emotional way that wasn't warranted, but it was from her emotions, instead of trying to correct it, right? In my first year, I was trying to always correct it. And what I ought to have been doing is just loving her and not affirming where that emotion's coming from. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying I should have loved her in such a way that I affirmed it. Yes, that's right. No, I just sat there and I listened and I allowed her to vent and I allowed her to get it out. And when she was done, we walked alongside each other again and I loved her more. Because now, here we are 3 years later, and we can talk about all those issues and all those problems and all those struggles that she had in that first year. And hey, I had a lot of struggles too. I'm not putting this all on my wife, but now we're able to talk about those things in our third year because our relationship has been built up. She trusts me more. She knows that my heart loves her and I'm only for her good and I want to help her overcome these things. We don't need counseling the way that we needed it in year one because now we can communicate. And so what as we move into the things that we are not for, right? The things that we disagree with, I think that's still important. I love this picture you started here so we can paint from it. That first year of love and listening and not affirming, but loving and listening so that when you enter into your second and third year, we can start to talk about those things. I think why I don't like what's happening right now, and we're going to talk about this, is the powers to be. It seems as if we were almost through that first year, right? Where we had loved each other and we had started to move out and now we were hoping. And every time we start to get into years 2 and 3 of the marriage, they want to jack us back up into that first year. They want to shove everything back into the first year, take all the pain, keep talking about it, keep bringing it up, keep revising it, keep pushing us back into the first year. So now we're back to where we can't really talk about it again. Now we're back to where we got to re-struggle about it. Morgan Freeman said this. Right, he said this on I think the Don Lemon show. He said Don Lemon was trying to put him in a place of like talk about racism. He said, no, not today, not the same today. No. He goes, well, how do we overcome? He said, stop talking about it. He said, stop talking about it like it was the same then it is today. Just stop talking about it. And so we're instead of getting driven back into that year, we need to get into the second and third year into this keeping with this marriage idea where we can talk about these pains and these struggles that we're affirming they're real. But if we don't communicate, if me and my wife never communicated about that, I would never understand. And I would never be able to go, yeah, babe, but I know you see things because of your past this way, but that's not really how reality is. And now my wife's able to go, oh, well, if I just look at it that way, I'd be able to be healed in this area. Yeah. And now we're starting to get on the same page, and we're starting to see. And even my wife taught me so much. By going through that pain with her, I learned so much, right? I mean, like, that's another thing. Like, there's a lot to be learned on this side as we walk through pain with people. That's part of life.
Yeah, we're going to be way better human beings if we would engage one another, and if white people would engage black people and vice versa to understand each other. We would grow in our relationship. Yes. We would be closer. We would love each other more.
And we would know what it means to be Christ more. We would grow in our sanctification in Christ if we would do such things.